Dan Humphrey settled for Serena van der Woodsen when he really wanted Blair Waldorf. And we have proof. Anyone who finished Gossip Girl knows very well that Dan ended up getting married to Serena. But was that who he really wanted to end up with all along? Here are 10 signs he totally settled for Serena after realizing he would never get the chance to end up with Blair. First, Dan fell in love with the idea of Serena, but he fell for Blair based on who she really was as a human being. When Dan first started crushing on Serena, he didn't even know who she really was as a person. He thought she was pretty. He liked looking at her body. He appreciated her outward exterior. He secretly launched the Gossip Girl blog to write about her, stalk her, and follow her life updates. But it was all based on the rose-colored idea he had about her. Serena was like a mysterious doll he placed on a pedestal. She wasn't real to him. When Dan started developing feelings for Blair, he knew exactly who Blair was at her core. That's the difference. There was nothing sugar-coated about Blair. Dan didn't have a weird, doll-like perception of Blair when he started falling in love with her. He knew that she was a strong-willed, ambitious, confident woman. He fell for Blair for who she was. He only loved Serena based on the unrealistic pedestal he placed her on. When he started noticing Serena's very real and very human flaws, his feelings for her dwindled big time. Second, the time Dan helped Blair become a runaway bride. Dan really stepped up for Blair when he helped her escape Prince Louis on their terrible wedding day. Blair knew she didn't want to stay in a loveless marriage, but she didn't know what options she had for escaping. Dan stayed by her side and accompanied her to the airport to help her get away. It was a true testament to how much he truly cared about her and loved her. Dan put himself in the crossfires of a wealthy, powerful, and royal family, just because he knew he wanted to protect Blair as much as possible. Talk about true love. Third, the time Dan and Blair started connecting over their shared love for film. When Dan and Blair hopped on phone calls together to watch movies at the same time, it was an obvious indication that his feelings for her were genuine. Dan and Blair's connection over their mutual passion for thought-provoking movies was something Dan never experienced with Serena. Serena always came across as someone with shallow interests compared to the depth Blair offered. Fourth, the time Dan offered to take on a stepfather role when Blair got pregnant. Dan proved that he was a true gentleman with a good heart when he offered to take on the stepfather role for Blair. We already knew Dan was a good person when he told Serena he'd be by her side during her rumored pregnancy scare. He also thought he was the father of Georgina's baby at one point, and he stepped up to the plate in that instance as well. But for Blair, he knew full well that Blair's baby was not his. Still, he was more than willing to step in and be there for her and her baby, knowing it belonged to another man. Fifth, the time he was vulnerable with Blair about his mother abandoning the family before he told Serena anything. An early sign of Dan's connection with Blair took place in the hallway when Blair was jealous of Serena for participating in a photo shoot for Waldorf Designs. In an episode called Bad News Blair, Blair's mom took a special interest in Serena, and Blair was left feeling totally rejected. After Serena dipped out, Blair sat alone in a hallway feeling depressed. Dan sat down with her and opened up to her about the pain he was feeling about his mother abandoning his family. As a reminder, Dan's mom relocated to Hudson without bringing Dan or Jenny with her. Dan's raw emotions were something he candidly shared with Blair, even though he hadn't even opened up to Serena about those heavy-hitting topics yet. Talk about foreshadowing for the relationship that would later unravel between Dan and Blair. Sixth, the time they didn't allow their first sex experience to ruin their sex life forever. Let's face it, the first time Blair and Dan hooked up was absolutely cringeworthy. They both thought it was a trash experience. However, they didn't give up entirely. They kept trying until they did start enjoying it together. Plenty of people in the real world would ghost a new partner after realizing there wasn't any sexual spark in the bedroom. The fact that Blair and Dan didn't give up on each other in the bedroom department says a lot about his willingness to fight for her and try harder for her. In contrast, Dan's first time having sex with Serena was pretty enjoyable for both of them. But if Dan's first time with Serena had been terrible, who's to say he would have kept trying the way he willingly worked to improve for Blair? Seventh, the time Dan wrote about Blair in his novel with love and admiration. Another obvious nod to the fact that Dan settled for Serena when he truly wanted to be with Blair comes down to the way he wrote about both women in his novel, Inside. Dan wrote about Serena in a way that made her sound selfish, immature, and shallow as hell. He had little to no patience when he was writing his manuscript with Serena in mind. But when he wrote about Blair, he had endless patience, love, and admiration flowing out of him. His thoughts about Blair were undeniably romantic. and those feelings translated onto the page for the entire world to see once Inside was published. 8th, the time Blair teamed up with Dan to save Rufus and Lily's marriage. In an episode called Ex-Husbands and Wives, Blair and Dan proved that they could work together as a solid team when it really mattered the most. They wanted to prevent Rufus and Lily from getting divorced, so they linked up to use Blair's manipulation tactics for good instead of evil. Their team efforts served as proof that they would have been a dominating force as a romantic couple had Blair chosen to be with him in the end. And 9th, the time Blair teamed up with Dan to take down Juliet Sharp. In an episode called The Townie, Blair and Dan proved that they were incredible as a team once again. Juliet was a vindictive and manipulative villain, and no one wanted to see her get away with her BS. Blair and Dan definitely made an impact when it came to ruining Juliet's power trip. They worked well together, and their chemistry was strong. 10th, the time they saw each other in a new light while handling their internships at W Magazine. In an episode called The Kids Are Not All Right, Blair and Dan's internships at W Magazine caused them to work with each other in close proximity. Although they started out exercising their competitive natures, eventually, they began seeing each other in a positive way that was both shocking and unexpected. Noticing each other's work ethic and shared passion for success was something they both found to be attractive about the other. Ultimately, they perfected the enemies to lovers trope. Blair and Dan are an ideal example of what it means to start off as enemies before becoming romantically connected in the most dramatically intense manner. And as a bonus, who could forget the time Blair relinquished her hatred for Brooklyn to spend time with Dan there? Blair spent so much of her time professing her disdain for Brooklyn, but she was willing to forget about all those negative feelings in order to pursue her love story with Dan while it was still in motion. Tons of Gossip Girl fans are on the same page with the belief system that Dan fully settled for Serena. They've even shared their thoughts about it on social media. One fan asked, "Do you think Dan ever got over Blair? I just don't think he did. He was still very much in love with Blair and then went back to Serena quite fast. It really looked like he just settled for Serena. I am just wondering if that was really the show's intention. Like, were they really going for this Dan settled for Serena theme, or is it just bad writing and fast pacing of the show?" Another fan added, "Dan loved Blair more than he did anyone else. You don't have to be a Dan and Blair shipper to admit that this might have been true. Her heart was always with Chuck, but from season 1, Dan was always there for her. Blair was horrible to Dan, but he still comforted her after her mother's photo shoot. She was the only one he didn't write a bad word about in his book. His opinion about her was the best, despite everything." A third fan chimed in with, "Dan 100% settled for Serena. I think he connected with Blair in a way he didn't connect with Serena. With Blair, they connected over similar interests like film and literature. I think he loved her brilliance and respected her more as a person. Dan loved that Blair was an intellectual. Serena was a playful little girl. I don't think he and Serena had the same click." Someone else joined the chat to say, "Dan and Blair are both super similar. Social climbers, hardworking, opportunistic, keen to follow their own path. Both of them dealt with parental abandonment. They both loved film and art. They were both drawn to Serena, etc. And really, the only thing that separated them is superficial, their upbringings and social classes. Add in the Gossip Girl reveal, and they were arguably the king and queen of scheming on the Upper East Side. Blair and Dan have way more in common than Chuck and Blair, or Dan and Serena, in my opinion. Do you think Dan truly settled for Serena when he wanted to end up with Blair? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below.